Imagine sitting in your living room one morning when suddenly a violent force erupts through your house. It starts off small, a few plates falling off shelves, but it quickly escalates. A pot breaks apart by itself and the food inside spills out. Soon, things all around the house start to tumble to the ground. You flee your house and seek shelter with a neighbour, only to find that whatever was doing this had followed you here too. This entity, this force, it wasn't tied to the house, it was tied to you.
So there's no escape?
No. Terrifying thought, isn't it? Well, something like this actually happened to a woman way back in 1772. What you're about to hear is the chilling true story of the Stockwell ghost. So as you've probably gathered, our story takes us to Stockwell in England. It's 1772, and back then Stockwell was part of the county of Surrey, not South London like it is today. So it was more of a rural area, think lots of greenery, some cottages and shady lanes lined with hedgerows. A beautiful place where an elderly lady called Mrs. Golding lived. It was a Monday morning in January and she was sitting in her parlour, probably enjoying a lovely cup of tea, as us Brits obviously love to do, when suddenly she heard an almighty crash coming from the kitchen. Before she could even get up out of her seat to see what was going on, her maid Anne burst into the room. Something very strange was happening, the maid told her. All of the crockery in the kitchen, the plates, the glasses, the saucers, they were tumbling off the shelves onto the floor. Wait for it, all by themselves. Anne led Mrs. Golding into the kitchen so that she could witness this bizarre spectacle for herself. There were broken bits of crockery all over the place. And the moment Mrs. Golding looked up towards the shelves, almost as if on cue, a whole row of plates crashed down onto the floor. No one was near them when it happened. Now, surely there was a logical explanation for all of this, but Mrs. Golding didn't have much time to think of one, because a few moments later, even more items around the house started to fall and break. A clock fell down and the case cracked. A lantern that hung on the staircase fell and the glass shattered. A clay pot that was filled with salted beef just broke apart and all of the beef spilled out. All these things falling and breaking made such a terrible racket. In fact, the noises coming from the house were so loud that the neighbours came rushing over to see what was going on. As luck would have it, one of the neighbours happened to be a carpenter. He was called Mr. Rowledge. He took a look around the house and gave his expert opinion on what was going on. Oof, it was not good news at all. He believed that the house, well, it was about to fall down. You see, an extra room had been added to the top of the house and he thought that it was far too heavy. Because of all that extra weight, the house's foundation was giving way. He advised that there was no time to waste. That house needed to be evacuated as soon as possible. So Mrs. Golding's very kind neighbours all rallied together to help. Mr. Gresham, who lived next door, told Mrs. Golding to go and shelter at his place. He, Anne and the other neighbours would try to remove as many of her belongings from the property as they could. Mrs. Golding thanked everyone and then rushed off to Mr. Gresham's house. The neighbours worked quickly to move Mrs. Golding's belongings from the house, and whilst they did that, Anne, for some reason, retreated upstairs. Mr. Rowledge shouted up to her that it wasn't safe. She needed to come back down right now. But Anne didn't respond. The other neighbours tried to get her to come down too, but Anne seemed to be ignoring them. After a while, Anne eventually made an appearance. She slowly walked down the stairs. She was so calm, so collected, it was like she didn't have a care in the world. Mr. Rowledge and the others couldn't believe it. Didn't she understand the gravity of the situation? This house could fall down any minute. Meanwhile, at Mr. Gresham's house, the stress of everything had finally caught up with Mrs. Golding. She felt dizzy, her chest felt tight and it was difficult to breathe. It wasn't long before poor Mrs. Golding passed out. Thankfully, Mr. Gresham was on hand to help. He quickly sent for a doctor, and word was also sent to Mrs. Golding's niece, who was called Mrs. Payne. Now, someone somewhere definitely got their wires crossed, because Mrs. Payne was actually told that her aunt had suddenly passed away, not just fainted. So of course, Mrs. Payne dropped everything that she was doing and she rushed to Mr. Gresham's house. When she arrived, thank goodness her aunt was doing okay. She was certainly still alive. A bit weak, but she had come to and was being attended to by a doctor. The doctor did what any good doctor of the time would do and bled Mrs. Golding.
You humans and your bloodletting. I'll never understand why you were so obsessed with it, and for so long too.
Hey, don't be so judgy. We're doing our best, and thankfully we've come a long way since then. The doctor wanted to examine the blood once it was cool, so it was left to sit in a basin on a table. Some of the neighbours had gathered at Mr. Gresham's house to keep Mrs. Golding company, but mostly to have a little bit of a tipple as a reward for a job well done. Moving all of those belongings was certainly thirsty work. They sat, they chatted, and Mrs. Golding was finally starting to feel a bit better. Then, something truly terrifying happened. Her blood, now congealed, leapt out of the basin onto the floor, and the basin broke to pieces. At the same time, a bottle of rum next to it also broke apart. Now that wasn't all. Mrs. Golding's belongings were being stored in Mr. Gresham's parlour, and her glasses and cups that were sitting on the sideboard started to dance around and tumble to the floor. Mr. Gresham had offered the neighbours a glass of wine or rum, but before he could open the bottles, they just shattered. It was starting to look like Mr. Rowledge had actually misdiagnosed the problem. Whatever had been happening at Mrs. Golding's house had followed her here too. Understandably, Mrs. Golding was quite shaken by this idea, and she didn't really know what to do next. In the end, she decided to go to another neighbour's house, a neighbour called Mr. Mayling. Of course, she worried that the paranormal activity might follow her there too, but I guess there was only one way to find out. Anne stayed at Mr. Gresham's for a while to help put what remained of Mrs. Golding's belongings into a back apartment. Interestingly, Mrs. Golding managed to enjoy a nice bit of peace and quiet at Mr. Mayling's. The entity hadn't followed her there. But the strangeness still continued at Mr. Gresham's. Mr. Gresham and Anne watched in horror as a jar of pickles turned upside down and a jar of raspberry jam just broke apart. The spirit, or whatever it was, wasn't done yet. 2 mahogany waiters in a box then cracked and broke to pieces. After around 45 minutes, Mrs. Payne went to go and fetch her aunt from Mr. Mayling's house. She worried that her aunt was being a little bit of a nuisance to everyone, and they had a family reputation to uphold, for goodness sake. So she insisted that her aunt come and stay with her, and also invited the Greshams round for dinner as a little bit of a thank you. Whilst they had dinner, they sent Anne to check on Mrs. Golding's house to make sure that it was still standing. Whilst Anne was gone, they had a lovely meal and nothing strange happened at all. Anne eventually returned and she actually had good news. The house hadn't fallen down, everything was as they had left it. Sadly, they couldn't rest easy just yet. When the Greshams went home and Mrs. Payne's children had been put to bed, all hell broke loose. At around 8 p.m, a row of pewter dishes, all except one, fell off a shelf onto the floor. Everyone watched as they rolled into the middle of the room where they stood still for a while. This was disconcerting enough, but then it got weirder. These plates, they all suddenly just turned upside down. Mrs. Payne, after getting over the initial fear, picked up the plates and put them on top of a dresser. And would you believe it, the same thing happened to them again. There were 2 eggs sitting on a shelf and one of them went on quite the adventure. It flew off the shelf, whizzed past the kitchen and hit this unsuspecting cat on the head before breaking.
No, the poor cat! That was uncalled for.
I know! I assumed that the cat was okay though and hopefully just a little bit startled. Anyway, the supernatural force ripped through the house, causing utter chaos. A pestle and mortar jumped high into the air before crashing down to the floor. Candlesticks jumped about, 2 hams hanging on either side of the kitchen chimney flew off their hooks. A mustard pot flew out of a closet and smashed. A cup flew across the kitchen, ringing like a bell. It then hit a dresser and smashed to pieces. Mrs. Payne and the others rushed about the house collecting up anything that hadn't yet broken and laying the items down on the floor. They hoped that in this way they could at least save some of their possessions. It didn't work though, they still broke. Everyone in the house was understandably terrified by what was going on. They had a few visitors during this time and none of them lasted very long. They all ended up fleeing in fear. There was one person though who didn't seem to be scared at all. Anne. She was always on the move, flitting from one room to another. The only time they could get her to sit still was when the family was praying. And interestingly, the entity was quiet during this time. Anne also told Mrs. Golding that she shouldn't be alarmed or uneasy, that these things could not be helped.
Ooh, suspicious. It sounds like Anne knows more than she's letting on.
It does, doesn't it? But maybe Anne had experienced something like this before. At around 10 p.m, they asked one of the neighbours, Richard Fowler, to come and stay with them. They were all so scared, and they thought that the extra company might help. Richard lasted until about 1 a.m, when it all got too much for him and he had to leave. Mrs. Payne was struggling too. She couldn't stand to keep watching all of these strange things happening. It was absolutely terrifying. Now, the activity seemed to be concentrated downstairs, so she made an excuse to go upstairs to try and get away from it all for a while. Mrs. Golding, though, managed to brave it out downstairs for quite a few hours more, but at 5 a.m, things got a whole lot worse. All the furniture began to violently tumble about. Drawers, the tables, the chairs. It was starting to actually look like the house could come down, so Mrs. Golding rushed upstairs to warn her niece. Her niece came downstairs to see what was going on for herself, and the scene waiting for her was unlike anything that she'd ever seen before. It really did look like the house could come down at any moment. So she quickly gathered up her children and took them out into the barn, hoping that they'd be safe there. Mrs. Golding thought that it was best that she leave her niece's house, and she rushed over to that neighbour, Mr. Fowler, who had kept them company earlier. Anne made sure that Mrs. Golding was okay, that she was nice and settled in at the neighbours, and then she went back to Mrs. Payne's house to help her out with the children. All was quiet at Mr. Fowler's house. That is, until Anne returned. The entity started up again. 2 candlesticks flew into each other, a basket of coals tipped over, and the coals fell out and rolled around the room. Anne then did something quite unexpected. She took Mr. Fowler over to one side and told him that he shouldn't let Mrs. Golding stay with him, because wherever she was, the same things would follow. Mr. Fowler heeded Anne's advice and asked Mrs. Golding to leave, but before she left, told her to consider within herself, for her own and the public's sake, whether or not she had been guilty of some atrocious crime for which Providence was determined to pursue her on this side of the grave. Mrs. Golding was quite taken aback by this. How could he ever suggest such a thing? She was a good, upstanding member of the Stockwell community. She knew in her heart that she'd done nothing wrong, that her conscience was clear. She didn't want to cause anyone any more trouble, so she went back to her own house with Anne and her nephew-in-law, Mr. Payne, in tow. When she arrived back home, her house, thank goodness, was still standing. It wasn't long, though, before the paranormal activity started up again. A 9-gallon cask of beer turned upside down. Then, what I think is the most terrifying thing of all happened. There was a pail of cold water on the floor, not next to anything that produced heat, and to everyone's horror, this water began to boil.
Demons! It's demons! I knew it!
Gargi, that's your explanation for everything. You need to be a little bit more imaginative with your theories. Next, a box of candles fell from a shelf, and the candles rolled out. Then the table in the parlour just fell over. Poor Mrs. Golding just couldn't escape. No matter where she went, this entity followed her. Or was it wherever Anne went? Mrs. Golding had this sneaking suspicion that maybe Anne had something to do with all of this. It was odd that she was so calm and collected throughout it all. And what about that strange comment she'd made about how these things could not be helped? Mrs. Golding thought back, and she realised that whenever Anne was gone, everything was quiet. She shared her suspicions with Mr. Payne, and the two of them hatched a plan to test this theory. They sent Anne to go and fetch Mrs. Payne. This was a way to get her out of the house. Just as they suspected, absolutely nothing happened while she was gone. The furniture wasn't dancing around, plates and cups were not tumbling to the floor. The house was as peaceful as could be. When Anne returned, Mrs. Golding fired her on the spot. And you know what? It worked. With her departure, the strange activity stopped. All was well in the Golding household. Word of this Stockwell ghost, as it was called, spread like wildfire. It was all anyone could talk about, especially as a pamphlet was published soon after, containing statements from all of the main witnesses. At the time, most people were convinced that this really was a true haunting, that some kind of supernatural force was involved. Many years later, though, a book written by a man called William Hone was released. In this book, he claimed that Anne had confessed to one of her later employers that it was all a hoax. Apparently, she wanted to get Mrs. Golding out of the house for the evening so that she could spend some alone time with her new lover. She fixed long horsehairs to some of the crockery and put wires under others. On pulling these, the movables of course fell. She made the water in the pail look like it was boiling by slipping in a paper of chemical powders. She threw things down when people weren't looking so that when they turned around, they'd see the object in motion and think that it was some kind of supernatural force that did it.
Wait, what? We're expected to believe she did all of this on her own and in 4 houses in front of so many different people. What about the blood leaping out of the basin? What about all that heavy stuff moving around?
I honestly don't know what to tell you, Gargi. Maybe it was a hoax, maybe it wasn't. It's pretty impressive either way though. Let me know down in the comments what you think. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe. If you want the house to yourself for a while, why not try faking a haunting? Just make sure you don't get caught. And as always, I hope you have a magnificent day.